So I'm Darren Bray from Pad Studio. We're based down in the New Forest. I'm going to talk about a much smaller scale project. All the wonderful other projects you've seen before are a much larger scale of our work, but the same principles kind of apply to our project. And I'm going to talk about teamwork, collaboration, and managing expectations. So 4 years ago, we were approached by a client who found us in the Yellow Pages to do our first public building. Client tried to do their best to convince us to do exactly the same. So this was the existing pavilion, only because this sat on their badge, on their tennis kind of t-shirts. So we kind of initially started out with this principle, and Ben was our concept architect. Spent a lot of time working very closely with the planners to try and come up with a proposal that would kind of work with the client's brief, but also to keep the client happy. So after we kind of moved away from the kind of traditional notion of a tennis pavilion, our next challenge really was to kind of connect the two sites. So the main challenge was to connect the two visually and at first floor level. So Ben's first kind of approach was to kind of look at a first floor terrace and then a very low gull wing roof at first floor level to accommodate cafe, bar, and viewing deck. So what we then had to kind of look at was how we were going to create our kind of first floor structure at a very low cost. So we started out thinking about using precast concrete panels, and after about 6 weeks of talking to lots of precast companies, we realized that none of them would actually work with us because it was just too much small scale. So we kind of got this the scheme through planning, and then basically the key part of the concept was to kind of link through at ground floor level. So we've got large spans connecting visually between the two parts of the client's site. So then we kind of moved on and created some computer renders. Now it's interesting, when you kind of produce your computer renders, you have to be extremely careful on your detailing, because if you move away from any of this, then people remember the computer renders from when you kind of submitted it for your plan application and in the press. So we've got elements of precast at the kind of slab level. We've also got precast elements at the parapet level. But then once we'd kind of moved away from trying to find a precaster to do our first floor, we had to kind of re-engineer the whole building. So we then worked with our structural engineer to essentially redesign the first floor slab as an in situ slab. So in talking about collaboration and teamwork, there's no way that this project could have worked or have been successful. So we've got our client, who basically turns out as a tennis coach, and then suddenly he's running a tennis center. And then we've got our team here from Pad. We've then got our concrete consultant, Jonathan Reed from Grey Matter Concrete, Toby Ronalds from Eckersley O'Callaghan, and we've got our construction manager. And again, talking about the kind of procurement process, it was critical to us that we went down a route of construction management, because our client wanted to work with someone on a daily basis who he knew, who he trusted, and we needed the flexibility to be able to kind of work through the process. So about 2 years ago, Elaine invited myself to come to Cafe Concrete. And at that very afternoon, I was introduced to this chap, Jim Saywood, who worked for JP Dunn at the time and was doing a fantastic project for Richard Rogers. This chap here, Jonathan Reed, some of you may know from Grey Matter Concrete, he made the introduction. This is him giving his impromptu CPD on the street over a pint. But it was this conversation that happened where we then basically were invited by Jim to go and have a look at their site, Old Burlington Street, that they were doing for Rogers. So we took our client along for a half-a-day session because they had every type of concrete on this site. So we went along with Ed, our construction manager. We took the client and we got a complete tour. So there's kind of special finish, there's ordinary finish, and there's basic finish. But it was critical to spend half a day with our client because we were talking about the difference in specification of 5, 10, 15, 20,000 pounds. And what was really interesting, after this visit, once we started to begin to talk about our concrete specification, the client insisted that we went for a special finish. After we said, if we go for the ordinary finish, we can save probably between 5 and 10,000 pounds. But it was because we went and did that site visit, the client basically signed up to the principle. They wanted something that was going to be beautiful, that they could then rent out the spaces. Now at PAD, we practice what we preach. So it's really important to kind of understand concrete. So this is our office down in Lymington. Jonathan Reed, who I've worked with for the past 10 years, we came up with a ridiculous idea when we moved office to cast around countertop. So we convinced a local contractor to build our formwork. We did all the drawings. And then I got Jonathan to come and spend a day with us, pushing me seriously out of my comfort zone. This is me vibrating concrete while the rest of the office are kind of busily working away on a Friday afternoon. But learning by making and visiting, looking at concrete examples, is absolutely critical. So back to the pavilion. This is our section through at first floor level. So basically what we've got to do is span right the way across from east to west, create a beautiful seamless soffit, but at the same time we've got to kind of deliver this for not a lot of money. So this is a very closed in detail. You can see we've got our first floor slab, where we've got our sort of special finish underneath. We've got some precast elements for the parapet and also some precast elements for the window reveals. We began to develop the concrete specification with the structural engineer, Jonathan Reed of Grey Matter Concrete, and Jim Seaward. So Jim Seaward we convinced to come and do our concrete soffit. And then we carried on producing our concrete specification, and that was basically shared between everybody on the team. We referred to the National Concrete Specification, and then we produced all our kind of formwork drawings. And again, they were all shared between everybody, so it wasn't just us kind of dictating what the concrete specification should be. So going back to our drawings, Ben produced a whole set of formwork drawings which were shared with everybody. So basically, we kind of came up with a specification that we were going to use a Weezer birch-flied phenolic foamed plywood across the soffit, and these were shared with everybody so they could give their input. So we created our own exposed concrete finishes specification, which was shared with the team. One of the things that we did write into the specification was post-finishing, and that came out of all the conversations with Jonathan Reed at Grey Matter Concrete. So again, we referred to the National Structural Concrete Specification through our document. And then we held a series of meetings to talk about the process with everybody on site. But one of the things we hadn't quite allowed for was that everybody was kind of so signed up to producing beautiful concrete. And the guys on site were so careful that we ended up with some pockets of concrete that weren't properly vibrated. So we ended up with a soffit that ended up with pockets within that soffit. So these are our precast elements. These were sourced from a company in North Wales. And again, when we first started out on the project, we had specified that this should be an in situ element. But actually, our construction manager, Edward, convinced us that this might not be the best way forward because, one, it would probably cost us more, and two, we probably wouldn't get the best finish. So we then kind of struck our soffit and started to kind of stand back. It was way more than 3 meters, as Elaine had kind of suggested. But as I said, that the guys that cast the concrete were sort of far too careful, and we did end up with some imperfections. So we did some trials. Jonathan Reed of Grey Matter Concrete came down, spent a day, and we basically kind of talked it through with a client, and we kind of reduced the kind of post-finishing back to about a day's work. And if there's anything that kind of Jonathan's taught us as a practice, it's spending time with the client so that when you do get some imperfections with the concrete, they've kind of been understood with those kind of tours, looking at different visual concrete, what can happen. So actually our post-finishing was reduced right back. So this is the finished main space where you get the light coming through that you can sort of see between the two main spaces. We kind of chose very careful artificial lighting. Again, you have to be really careful with your lighting of the soffit because it can change the way that you view concrete across a space, and we had some quite dark pockets in corners. So these are the finished pictures. So we've got precast elements at parapet level. This is our soffit after it had some post-finishing. What's quite interesting is when you kind of add other materials against the concrete, it kind of gives that kind of warmness. And again, if there's anything that kind of Jonathan has taught us as a process, it's really important when you stand there with a client and you're kind of looking at your concrete, not to view the concrete on its own, to view it in its kind of overall, when you've got those other complementary warm materials within. So this is the kind of finished ground floor space where the client and Canoe Lake Leisure hold their main kind of exercise classes. You can see that right in the dark corners of this space, the way that the concrete changes is vastly different, the way that the light kind of falls across. So this was finished back last summer. It was finished 2 weeks before the client held their first LTA tournament. So basically, the client signed up to hold this tournament as we were kind of going through the process, and we were kind of severely delayed, but it's kind of testament to everybody within the team that we achieved a fantastic overall aesthetic. And I think when you look at the final piece of architecture, it's actually not a million miles away from those early images we did. I think in the end, we actually saved about £100,000 on the project by going down a construction management route. So I think it just shows that even at a small scale, you can still achieve fantastic visual concrete.